Robert Mueller to testify in Congress?
Well, I'm going to leave that up to our very great Attorney General, and he'll make a decision on that.
As President Trump, of course, whether or not Special Counsel Robert Mueller should comply with that congressional request to testify about the Russia investigation. This is House Judiciary Committee Chairman, Democrat Jerry Nadler. He's warning that the U.S. is facing, quote, a constitutional crisis, his words, after his panel votes to hold Attorney General William Barr in contempt for failing to turn over the full unredacted report. Here is our House Democrats' Chief Deputy Whip Dan Kildee responded to that earlier today.
I don't think we're there yet, but I think we have to all sort of dial down the rhetoric. I think the American people, at least the people I represent, they're sort of two minds. They do want to make sure that the rules apply to everyone, but I think they would prefer that we stop hyperventilating, focus on the facts.
So what are the facts? Chris Stazak joins us, former senior investigative counsel for Congress and a former New York assistant attorney general. Alex Little, criminal defense and litigation attorney down in Nashville, is also a former prosecutor, former U.S. assistant U.S. attorney. Welcome to you both, as always.
Good afternoon.
Alex, let me start with you. Man, it's the White House versus Congress on a whole range of issues, from executive privilege to who will testify to keeping them not testifying. How do you think this is going to play out, especially when it hits the courts?
Well, you know, I think the courts are going to have some say in this, but I think right now it's mostly about delay tactics for the administration. The longer they can withhold things and delay the start of any sort of court proceeding, the longer they get what they want, which is to keep this information quiet. You know, this is really the next stage. We get into sort of unpacking some of the stuff in the Mueller report. I think the Mueller testimony is really the big question. If they try to block him from testifying, there's going to be a fight about that, and it's going to be a significant fight. If they allow him to testify, I think really the ball's up in the air, and it depends on what happens at that testimony.
Chris, do you expect that we will eventually hear from Mr. Mueller himself?
I do think we'll hear from him eventually, and with respect to Mr. Nadler's subpoena in particular, I don't think it's delaying tactics. Presidents since George Washington have been fighting with Congress, and in this case, it's clear that Congress has very broad powers to investigate, but it's also clear that the presidents have power to fight subpoenas. President Obama did it when with the Fast and Furious, when Eric Holder was held in contempt, and this is all part of the process. It's certainly not a constitutional crisis. In fact, this is how the Constitution is supposed to work.
So you're basically saying this is the tension between the legislative branch and the executive branch playing out in real time.
Exactly, and this isn't going to be resolved anytime soon with the courts. I think from the time Eric Holder was in contempt till it was resolved, it was over, I believe, 6 years. So this isn't going to happen overnight.
Well, Alex, do you agree with that, or do you think there's something more at stake?
No, this is a very different situation than all of those previous cases, because what they're trying to hold back from the public is misconduct that the president was engaging in. This is not at all like Fast and Furious. This is much more akin to if we had the Kent Starr report, instead of it being released on the internet the next day, the White House saying, I'm not going to let you see that because it says bad things about me, maybe my family members. So this is a very different sort of attack on sort of the constitutional balance of power, because the White House is saying, no, we're not going to give you information that's been uncovered about the bad things we've done. And I think that's a very different character than any sort of past dispute of this sort.
So what happens to it?
Well, you know, I think ultimately the Congress is going to have to take some serious steps if they want to protect their institutional interests, and then the court's going to have to act. And whether or not that happens, you know, we got a Supreme Court that is majority conservative right now. It's going to land in their hands.
And do you believe, as Mr. Nadler says, and Chris disagrees, that we are in a constitutional crisis?
I think we've been in a constitutional crisis since Jim Comey was fired. We have a president who has actively been subverting the judicial process, the investigative process. The Mueller report says that. There's 10 incidents. You know, there are 475 former prosecutors who said if this president weren't the president, we would have indicted him for obstruction of justice. So when you have a president that is willing to break the law, I mean, even today, where he asks, you know, individuals to investigate what is likely to be his presidential opponent, you know, this is not the sort of thing that we should look at lightly. And the fact that the Republicans just seem to be humming and ignoring the fact that we are in a constitutional crisis is really disturbing.
Chris, do you see Republicans ignoring that and what Alex brings up?
I don't think Republicans are ignoring it. In fact, I worked for House Democrats for Chairman Cummings, and the law is the same whether it's allegations of a president misbehaving or anyone else. The law works the same. And for example, what Mr. Nadler's looking for here, among other things, what he has been looking for is all the underlying information with the Mueller report. And that is prohibited from release under the law. But they're holding him in contempt for following the law. I do agree with Alex that the courts will have to weigh in on this. But the other point that I would make with respect to what Alex just said about excuse me, about investigating potentially Vice President Biden. In this case, you have a Democratic chairman of the House Judiciary Committee who's trying to issue a subpoena for information that's what he believes will be derogatory about the sitting president. I think we could all imagine what would happen if the Senate committee, like for example, Senator Lindsey Graham, who has subpoena power, if he issued a subpoena for a Democratic candidate's information, I don't think the reaction would certainly not be the same.
But it's not about information, Chris. We're not trying to say we want to go digging in some hole where there's nothing there. This is not a wild goose chase. We know the president has done behaviors that a former head of the FBI, who is also the Assistant Deputy Attorney General Mueller when he was in the Department of Justice, who's very well respected, has said is extremely problematic. This is not just digging to dig.
And final question, overall. Mueller, can you describe what is the legal basis for him to come or not to come? Chris, let me ask you that, because as I understand it, he's not a DOJ employee, they say, in a few weeks. Can the president still claim executive privilege? Can the White House still prevent him from appearing, even if he is not an employee? Is he barred forever from speaking out?
Well, you hit on the...
Go ahead.
You hit on the key issue, Eric. Sorry. You hit on the key issue, which is once he's a private citizen, the legal issues are very different. Once he's a private citizen, if he's asked to testify and he wants to, he can. As long as he's a DOJ employee, there are other issues such as privilege, so it's a more gray area. But once he's a private citizen, he can testify.
So you think we'll see him?
I do. I don't know when. It might be 2 weeks. It might be a month. But I think he will testify.
Alex, you think you'll see him too eventually?
I do. I think he probably wants to testify. He maybe didn't want to until the Attorney General did what he did, but I suspect he wants to have his moment.
All right. Well, he seems like Joe Friday, just the facts, and we'll see what happens when indeed it comes before the cameras. Likely to testify, say our panel, and they know what they're talking about. Chris and Alex, good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course. Well, flooding.